In 1934, the veterans of foreign wars put up a cross out in the Mojave Desert. It was a memorial to all of those who fell during World War I. The cross was only 7 feet tall, rather small. They had placed it on a stony outcropping, a little hill, out in the middle of virtually nowhere. To see it, I read, you'd have to leave Los Angeles and drive nearly 4 hours northeast on U.S. Highway 15, then turn south on Sema Road, a 2-lane blacktop, drive for 9 miles until you enter the Mojave National Preserve. More than likely, you won't see any other travelers along that road. Once you've arrived at Sunset Rock, you'll be able to see the cross on top of that little rocky hilltop. You won't see any other signs. There are no inscriptions. There's no granite monument describing it or even telling you why it's there. Just a simple little white cross where it has stood for 82 years. In 2001, a Park Service employee sued the government, demanding that the cross be removed. And that began a 10-year battle that ended not too long ago. In fact, at one point, a judge ordered that the cross be covered with a plywood box so that it kind of looked more like a billboard than a cross, but evidently that wasn't good enough. For some reason, this was troubling, this little cross, to our national conscience. And so you had the American Humanist Association, the Atheist Alliance International, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, People for the American Way, and the American Civil Liberties join in a campaign to take this cross down. This particular case would be battled all the way up to the Supreme Court. And on April 28th, 2010, the court narrowly ruled by one vote that this little cross could stay on top of the hill. Less than 2 weeks later, thieves cut the mounting bolts and got rid of the cross, and it's never been seen since. Even in the Mojave Desert, where almost no one ever saw it, the cross was and is a foundation marker that must go. In more recent days, the interfaith group called the American Clergy Leadership Conference, whenever you hear clergy, run. They are calling for churches, by the way, everywhere in this country to remove their crosses. Now, their spokesman said that the cross was a symbol of oppression, and it represented an attitude of superiority. And so their representative, Reverend George Stallings, Archbishop of the Imani Temple African American Catholic Church in Washington, didn't want to leave anybody out of that one, said, let's all just take them down. You know, it strikes me that the Apostle Paul had the same problem too, didn't he? With his culture, different people, different reasons, and yet it is a troubling marker. So he writes to the Corinthians that the preaching of the cross, the singing of the cross, which we did together, is to the Jews a stumbling block. It's in the way. And to the Greeks, it's stupidity. That's how you could render that word. It's foolishness. Now, frankly, the desire of our unbelieving world, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, just rehearsing it together, is not just to remove the foundation, it is to remove any memory of the founder. That's the bigger issue. A few years ago, I read in my research, as I was just going through different articles. In fact, I had one of our seminary students in my class do some research for me. The new Capitol Visitor Center opened in Washington, D.C. just a couple of years ago, $621 million center designed as a a gathering place, a rest stop, information center for literally thousands of visitors that come to the capital of our country every year. Before it opened, one particular congressman was given, among others, a pre-tour of this center, and he noticed immediately omissions. One panel on a wall announced that America's national motto was, translated from Latin, out of many, one. When in fact our national motto, established by Congress in 1956, is, in God we trust. Another display featured a replica of the speaker's rostrum, the area where he sits, but it had omitted the words, in God we trust, that are inscribed just above his chair. Everything about the rostrum was identical, but no, in God we trust. He noticed another exhibit. It displayed the table, the actual table, where Abraham Lincoln had placed his Bible at his second inauguration. The table was there, but no what? Take a guess. Bible. No Bible. Another odd omission, which kind of showed how deeply the designers of the Visitor Center, wanted to erase God out of anything to do with our history. They here on this particular omission, they couldn't say, "Oops, we forgot the Bible." There was a display of the Constitution. However, the clause just before the signatures, which read, quote, "done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present, the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1787. The new version had all of that except the words, in the year of our Lord. I mean, you just can't mention God. He's troubling. And the trouble is, the real danger to any culture and in any country, and the Apostle Paul, by the way, don't ever forget, lived in it, is that when you remove the absolute proposition of the existence of a creator God, you invite into your own personal life, into your own generation, into your own culture, into your own nation, all sorts of harm, all sorts of danger and error. It was famously written by Dostoevsky, that famous quote, "If there is no God, anything is permissible." Anything is permissible. Dostoevsky was a Russian author, and he was forbidden, by the way, to be read during Joseph Stalin's reign when Stalin came to power. And interestingly enough, Stalin's own daughter, Svetlana, whose biography I tried to read this summer, just came out, a massive biography about that thing, about 400 pages, and I got through 300 and finally gave up and skipped to the last chapter and found out how she died. At any rate, Svetlana would sneak into her room and read her forbidden novels by Dostoevsky. She would, by the way, later defect to the United States. Died just a couple of years ago. But think of the truth of that. If there is no God, then anything is permissible. And what has become permissible? Today it isn't even headline news for all that long for abortionists to be caught on tape talking of crunching bones and baby parts for sale. In fact, just this month, California's Assembly voted not to restrict abortion or try to encourage women to realize that the baby they're carrying more than likely by then has fingernails and heartbeats. They voted to force pro-life pregnancy healthcare centers into posting announcements that these women could obtain a free abortion covered by Medi-Cal. And they are even now required to post those signs, and it's demanded that they post them in 24 font type, large enough so that they can all see free abortions here in a pregnancy pro-life help center. That's like posting a big announcement at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that free beer is available after the meeting. And how ridiculous is that? But with the exclusion of God, the value of life is one of those foundation markers that just sort of goes away. In fact, more chilling will be the fact that the elderly will have less and less of a defense for living. I was given this article at a recent bioethics conference. A professor of theology, no less, gave a lecture where she said that personhood is not automatically given to human beings. It is assigned by culture. That's chilling. Think Third Reich and Jews. She said, and I quote, "An Alzheimer's patient without any memory and without people to care for them ceases to be a person. Someone who still has friends or family who love and remember them maintain their personhood." I couldn't help but wonder what she will think if she ends up with Alzheimer's one day. And what about personhood anyway? You remove the Creator and all that's up for grabs. You remove the wonderful discovery where Jeremiah and the psalmist say, "You, God, ordain my being. You know who I am. I am something, someone. I have personhood before I'm even delivered." But you get rid of the Creator and everything's now for grabs. One author described us now kind of moving into what he called in his journal article, a genderless wasteland, where people are no more born male or female, but where they determine their own gender. And should they choose to change their gender, they are applauded as heroes. And of course, as I mentioned in our earlier study today, marriage as we knew it no longer has definition in our culture according to Scripture. In fact, a few months ago, Rob Bell, an apostate former pastor who built a large church in Michigan, who really was a universalist, and it just took a while for him to come out, and he did. He was being interviewed by Oprah Winfrey on her wonderfully theologically correct television show, in which this former Protestant pastor, best-selling by the way, who just wrote a book, ironically, on marriage, said this, and I quote, "Marriage, gay and straight, is a gift to the world because the world needs more, not less, love." And Oprah interrupted him and asked, "When is the church going to get that?" And he responded, "We're close. We're moments away from the church accepting it." And he's right. Not this church, but the church at large. It has picked up its own eraser, and clergy are helping as if they're enthusiastically, gleefully able to participate in removing foundations. Just weeks ago, First Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina, I may have mentioned it, I'm not sure earlier, a member of the South Carolina Baptist Convention has now voted to allow the marriages of homosexual couples and ordained them into ministry. Now, shouldn't we have expected this? I mean, does any of this catch any of us off guard? I don't think so, right? After all, our media, our public schools, our universities have, for the most part, for decades been willing instruments of propaganda to indoctrinate a generation in the normalization of evolution and atheism and immorality. Erwin Lutzer, in fact, recently wrote about the daughter of one of his volunteers at Moody Church. The teacher of that public middle school classroom told the students, he wrote, to choose one side of the classroom and walk over to it. The teacher then said, this side over here is for the students who claim to be gay or support their gay friend's lifestyle. And the teacher said, and the other wall on the other side of the room is for the bullies. So you choose. You either agree or you become a bully in your dissent. What they really ought to do, what that teacher ought to do, is read the biography of Svetlana Stalin and try to make it all the way to the end. Where even during Stalin's reign, and I read enough, even someone who verbalized the possibility of a disagreement with the state disappeared. Let me remind you, though, beloved, what we're facing isn't new. It might be new to us, but it isn't new to the scope of history. It isn't new to the scope of church history. It has not caught God off guard. And I want us to have this new sense of vision and mission that God has chosen to call us, to summon us to this particular generation, in this particular country, at this particular point in time. We all need to carry in our hearts a sense of the responsibility of being able to answer the questions, of being able to respond with grace and truth, to be able to answer the questions that are raised about these scriptures and our God and our views and our morals. Because as I've said to this congregation before, and I'll say it again, we are not living anymore in a post-Christian culture. We are living in a pre-Christian culture. This is the time when Jesus Christ decided to create the church, and by the descent of the Holy Spirit, it was created in that generation. So for us, the more we look like them, the more it might be in the mind of God the perfect time to be a church. None of our challenges are all that original. In fact, when Spurgeon preached in London in the mid to late 1800s, the homosexual community had their own red light district. Prostitution was rampant. Child labor, you might as well call it abuse, was ignored by even the leadership of that country. In fact, Parliament would be unable to meet at different times because too many of its members would be drunk. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand by the analogy to history that it isn't grievous to me to see values and virtues turned upside down. It is deeply troubling to me to see, because I know the hurt that we're only inviting culture-wide, to see God erased from our landscape. It's discouraging for me to see the White House bathed in rainbow colors in honor of the Supreme Court's decision to knowingly, willfully defy God. So don't misunderstand my reference to historical analogy. It is tragic to see any culture, especially mine. This is my country and yours. To see it literally given over to the swamp of drugs and alcohol and pornography and abortion and greed and promiscuity. All of it justified, all of it magnified, all of it now applauded. I agree with one of our country's forefathers who was already concerned 200 years ago when he said, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever." So the question for us is, what do we do? How do we respond in every generation, in every nation, to one degree or another? The church has to answer this question. Like Dr. Arno Gabeline, now with the Lord, a Bible scholar of great renown, called this the burning question of the day. And he wrote that in 1939. This happens to be the question of King David, the songwriter. In fact, David thought this was so significant that he handed it to his choir master, and he said, "I want you to put this into music because I want the nation singing this." David's question is as critical today as it was when it was composed 3,000 years ago. So I have selected this psalm to begin our series, and I want you to turn to Psalm 11. Psalm 11. Everything else you've heard was just an introduction. We're really only going to get this thing started tonight. But his question kind of burns into your conscience and your heart. So go over to verse 3 and just look at it. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now would you notice here what he says, or what he doesn't say? He doesn't say, what do the righteous do when the roof falls in? Notice? What do you do when the door won't open? What do you do when the windows get stuck? No, he's saying, what do you do when the very foundation upon which life around you is supported is destroyed? That is the burning question of the day. Now go back to verse 1. David actually begins with his statement of trust and dependence. It's really a statement of faith. The first phrase, in the Lord I take refuge. He doesn't write, in my kingdom I take refuge. In my generation I take refuge. In my house, in my little world where I live, I take refuge. No, in Yahweh I'm secure. Now, commentators are hard-pressed to try to identify exactly the trouble David is facing here when he writes this song. Some of them are a little easier to date. This one isn't. They don't know if it's, when Saul is tracking him down and there on those rocky bluffs he runs for his life. They don't know. It could possibly be when Absalom has successfully just about nearly completed his coup d'etat, and David is on the run, and David's closest counselor has betrayed him and turned against him. We don't know. But here's what we do know. We do know that someone who follows after God is not guaranteed a smooth ride. That's what we do know, because he's writing this. We do know that we have not been given from God the right of approval. I really fear in these days to come that the church is going to cling on to rights and claim them as if God gave them. Yeah, we're going to have some comforts taken away, and there may be marginalization and maybe even penalties or fines. We don't know. I've been asked this summer, what happens if they take away, the tax deduction of the church because of our discriminatory policy? I'll tell you what will happen. Our giving as a congregation in July will match what we do in December. Wouldn't that be exciting? This past December, in 10 days, our church gave $1.2 million. Wouldn't that be great in July? That would be exciting. You're looking at me like, oh, what is he talking about? Think about it. We're all affected by that. Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with that marginalization? King David here he isn't marginalized. He's running for his life. He's out there in the wilderness. And this example at least gives us the principle to apply that when you follow God, that doesn't mean that, everything just settles down. People applaud you, people appreciate you, people give you a chair at the table and welcome you. The church has been diluted, I'm afraid, for decades. The world will now become what the world has always been, and the masks will come down. So notice, here's the advice. He has this conversation, though he doesn't name the person, but he's talking back to someone, and he says, how can you say to my soul? By the way, that means this advice that he's about to hear or has heard has affected him deeply. How can you say something that has impacted my very soul? What is this advice? Flee as a bird to the mountain. Run, David. Run. Hide. It's your only avenue. That's your only option. Run. You can't fight. You're like a little bird. You can't defend yourself. Fly away to safety. How many have listened to this kind of advice over the years who've flown away to some nunnery or monastery, to some sideline, to some cottage by the lake where they've escaped the rat race, the pressures of culture, the needs of community, the mission of the church. Some, safe place where I'm just going to preserve my little life. It's interesting, a woman came up to me. Excuse me. Turn me off. Thank you. Wow. A woman came up to me after the church service today, and she said, I have friends that are talking about going and buying property and building a commune and disappearing. Run. Our mission is not to escape our world. Our mission is to engage our world with the gospel. But let's not minimize the danger. In fact, notice verse 2. For behold, David writes, the wicked, this person says to David, the wicked bend the bow, they make ready their arrow upon the string to shoot in darkness at the upright in heart. I just pulled away for it a little bit and did a little research on the bow and arrow. To us, that's it's not really, the atomic bomb, but for them it was. Most feared weapon of the day. This redefined battle. This redefined an enemy attack. You didn't have to worry about hand-to-hand combat if you had a good team of archers. If you could shoot a bow and an arrow first. In fact, the oldest complete bow discovered by archaeologists had been crafted 1,000 years before David lived. And that design was so remarkable that to this day, I learned in my study, some of the best wooden bows are still copying its design. Did you notice that they have David in their sights? It says here, it's in the nighttime, in the darkness. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, says in a moonless night, just to sort of increase the drama. In the moonless night, you are in the sights of an archer. Thank you. This is another way of saying, David, you're a sitting duck. Nighttime, there's an archer, you're in the open, you're in his sights, you don't have a chance. Now, these advisors are actually using verb tenses that really ratchet up the tension. In fact, if I translated it with those tenses in mind, it would be along the lines of the sun has already set, they have already pulled back the string, they have already set the arrow, they already have you in their sights, and you can't see them because it's dark. This is like a firing squad. This is the moment where you hear that man shout, ready, aim. It's in that brief moment that David's writing this. There's nothing you can do. I saw a cartoon once where two men are pictured standing against a wall. They're facing a firing squad. They're tied up. They're blindfolded. The commandant shouts, ready, aim. And the one guy turns to the other and says, I have a plan. You don't have a plan between aim and fire. That's why the first stanza of this song ends with the question, how hopeless can it be? How difficult can it be? How gut-wrenching can it be? The enemies of that which I believe, David said, they've already strung their bow, they've set their arrow, they have me in their sights, there's nowhere to go. And his friends come along and say, we've got a plan, one thing you can do, and that is hope you turn into a little bird and fly away. Which doesn't help at all, because you can't turn into a little bird and fly away. You got to get up tomorrow morning and re-enter the rat race and face the pressure. What do you do when the foundations are destroyed? Not crumbling. Gone. The word David uses for foundation is a rare word. It comes from a Hebrew word meaning the settled order of things. David is sort of likening society to a building. His culture, his life to a building. And the foundations of society are law and order and truth and justice and morality and decency and integrity and on down the line, right? All the virtues you can think of. But when the unrighteous in darkness shoot away effectively, not just at David or the believer, but the very foundations, filling them with arrows, bringing them to naught, what do? When the foundational principles of right and wrong are destroyed? What then? David will answer that question in his second stanza 8 different ways. And we will expound on all 8 of them in our next session. Don't read ahead. We're going to cover all of them. But let me give you this before we stand, sing, and prepare to enter our world. In the meantime, let me give you this to reassure you and your soul. There is a foundation underneath the foundations. There is a granite foundation under the sandstone crumbling foundations of our culture. It is the granite foundation of God's purpose and God's plan and God's power. He isn't saying, oh my. This is fitting into his design for us, for our church, for our country, for our world, ultimately for his kingdom. So whenever we do see those things which are dear to our heart and they crumble and they may be gone, remember, underneath them is a foundation and it will never, ever crumble.